Well, good morning and thank you. And I'm glad you're back as we continue to begin our introductory look at the letter to Titus. I know some of you may be anxious to get into some specific passages, but context is critically important when we want to understand the full message that's delivered by these letters. And so I think it's important for us to take time to talk about what were the social dynamics, spiritual dynamics that were taking place around the church and the writing of this letter, but also to come to understand who Titus was a little bit more. Well, as I mentioned, he was a pretty important character in Paul's ministry. He's mentioned 13 or 14 times in the New Testament, which puts him up in really kind of the top 3 or 4 people that were around the Apostle Paul. And so his mentions come in not only the letter to Titus, but also in 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and other places, where we began to find out that he was a very, very close companion and co-worker with the Apostle Paul. I would say probably second only to even Timothy. It might be even possible that he was closer in terms of the practical doing of the ministry than Luke was, where I've shared before that Luke had a unique perspective as Paul's physician and probably spent most of his time making sure that Paul was healthy enough to continue carrying out his ministry. But Titus, like Timothy, was one of those young men who had great capacity, a great anointing and empowerment by the Lord, and he was able to entrust with some really challenging tasks, as is evident by this letter that he sends to him while Titus is really trying to reorganize or organize the church in Crete. It's kind of special to me because we just got back from Crete recently, and it was my first time there. What a lovely place. But in the time of Paul, it was a part of the Roman Empire, one of those islands that was key trading outposts, that ships coming from the southern Mediterranean, from Egypt and beyond, would certainly transect through Crete on their way to Corinth and then finally on to Rome. So a pretty important place, a very busy place. Even to this day, it's a very busy place, a major seaport. But who was Titus? Well, we first run into him in Antioch of Syria, as I mentioned yesterday, and he was a Gentile who had been a convert. And when Paul speaks about him in the beginning of this letter in verse 4, he says he was a true son in our common faith. Now, there's something interesting here in this phrase, common faith, because obviously Paul's saying, you share the truth of the gospel exactly as I hold the truth of the gospel. So, in other words, he's saying that Titus was a direct disciple of his ministry and his ministry to this young man. And he said, so much so that you become like a son. And it's interesting, this relationship of sonship, because what sons do is they tend to find their identity in their fathers. This is where it's really tough when young men grow up without a father. Then they try to find a surrogate, a replacement. And unfortunately, in many places, this is where kids end up getting hooked up with gangs because they're looking for a family to be a part of. And oftentimes the gang leader becomes like their mentor, who sets them or really defines for them what does it mean to be a man. Well, Paul was really that guy who helped Titus to understand what does it really mean to be a man of God. He was a spiritual father to him. And then he used this term, it's interesting, the common faith. The word common in the original language, as it's used by the Greeks, have really kind of 2 meanings, because if you were speaking to a Greek person or a Roman or somebody who spoke Greek, the word that was used here meant something that was held in common, held together. We believe the same thing. But interesting to the Jews, when they used this word, and this comes up a lot in the Gospels, they viewed anything that was common as being profane and unholy. So there's kind of a double meaning here. He says we're participants in the same common faith. We share it together, but it's a faith that is viewed by the Jewish world as being profane and unholy and even blasphemous. So Titus had come to understand in his journeys with Paul that everywhere that Paul went, the people who responded became people who held in common with them that same belief, same trust, that same spiritual journey. But as they did so, they became automatically opposed by the Jews, who considered them to be blasphemers and profaners of Judaism. And so that's why we find in the Gospels that, or excuse me, in the letters, that every place Paul went, it was the Jews who were chasing him, running him from place to place. And Titus, though he was a Gentile, he became kind of part of the indictment, because later on, when Paul is accused by the Jews of having brought a Gentile into the temple, it's very possible that it may have been Titus who he brought with him, but Titus didn't go into the temple. He had just been seen with Paul in the city. Titus would never have gone into the temple in Jerusalem because he wasn't a Jew, he wasn't circumcised, and they were only allowed to go so far. So there was literally actually a wall about a straw that went around about 3 or 4 feet tall, and it had literally warnings on it, signs that said, Jews only, and if you go beyond this point, you may suffer death. And it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, so nobody could misunderstand what was there. So a Gentile could go up onto the temple platform that was built there by Herod, and he could see the temple, and he could pray out there to the temple if he chose, but he could not go beyond the certain point, which was considered to be the sacred ground. So basically, Titus is this son of the faith who shares this common faith, who is sees Paul as like a father to him, and yet always there is this outward view of him by the world around him that he really was either a betrayer of the Greek culture or a betrayer of the Jewish culture. And that created a special challenge. Because when they went into a city, they would look at Paul, the Gentiles look at Paul and just say he's just one of those Jews with another crazy Jewish doctrine or belief. But they look at Titus and go, well, so what are you? You're not a Jew, but you're hanging out with this guy who is a Jew. Where are you coming from? And I think it's important for us to understand that was not an easy place to be, because reality is that the only people who really understood you, even within the church, were people who shared Paul's view of the gospel of grace that did not include the works of the law. Well, in 2 Corinthians 8:23, Paul makes this statement about Titus. He says, "As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. And as for our brothers, they are representatives of the church and an honor to Christ." So Titus had his own entourage, if you will, probably mostly Gentiles, and they began to really focus on not trying to reach the Jews, but to focus on reaching the Gentiles. And this is a really interesting bifurcation that we began to see in the ministry of the church. Paul understood that in order to reach Jews, he had to come to them as a Jew. He says, "To all men I become all things." So to the Jew, I became a Jew. To the Gentile, I became a Gentile. We realize that he wasn't trying to pretend to be something he wasn't, but he understood that he needed to be sensitive to where people are at so that he could speak to them in a vocabulary and a language and even a style that they could relate to. So Paul would go into synagogue and he would reason through the Old Testament scriptures to get them to believe that Christ was the Messiah. Now, in contrast, Titus would have to go to the Gentiles with a very different message. They didn't embrace the scriptures. They didn't believe in there being one God. They believed in multiple gods. And so, much like we see Paul in Athens, where he's addressing the Athenians based upon Greek culture and Greek philosophy, I think that Titus and many others who were Gentiles by birth would have sought a way of ministering to their own people in a very, very different way. But Paul wants to make it clear. His style may be different, but our message is the same, and we are fellow workers. And this is one of those kind of issues that has really kind of been tossed around and really kind of disturbed the church, because we find that from time to time and generation to generation and age to age that the fads of how we present the gospel change. And I think the one thing we need to understand is that the style that through which we share the gospel can change and alter, but the message should never be compromised. And so it's kind of like if you look at music, that Christian music doesn't have to be in only a major key, as one guy told me. He says, if it's on minor key, I know it's of the devil. Okay, whatever. But the bottom line is that the style of music should not be the defining thing. I remember when my youngest son was in a Christian rock band, we took him overseas to Russia and different places to do concerts, and their style was this indie style of music, if you have any idea even what that is. I really liked it. And I was interested because we would print the lyrics to their songs that they sang in English on the screen behind them in Russian. And I remember one Russian lady coming up to me and saying, when I first saw these guys, I thought, how can they be Christians? But now I'm reading the lyrics and everything they're saying is gospel. Everything they're saying is true with Scripture. And so she said, the music isn't my gig, but they're preaching the gospel to a generation of kids who understand that music. And I think that for me, when I first became a Christian, was a real struggle. But I think we have to always be open to the idea that sometimes our minds can get locked into our preferences. And the way I put it is we tend to sanctify our preferences. In other words, whatever I prefer becomes the right way to do it. And I think I need to step back oftentimes and look at what people are doing or how they're doing ministry and saying, are they preaching the gospel? Just because it's different than what I do, are they preaching the gospel? Are they presenting the full gospel of Jesus Christ? Now, sadly, today, there are many churches who are really preaching what I call a punctuated gospel. They're leaving out things that they think will be offensive, and that's not preaching the whole gospel. So the style that they do it in doesn't really bother me. But what bothers me is when they start leaving certain things out. So those are kind of things that we need to be discerning about. It's not just simply what kind of music they're playing it, but what is the content of that music. Anyway, out of time. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow. Blessings.